The footage. It began with nothing unusual. No alarms, no alerts, no reason to pay special attention. Just another night inside the monitoring room where time passed slowly and uneventfully. The security guard sat alone beneath the dim fluorescent lights, surrounded by a wall of screens. Each one showed a different hallway, a different entrance, a different empty space. Places designed for movement, but currently holding none. This was the job, to watch places where nothing happened, to stay alert in case something did. Hours passed without interruption. The building remained quiet. Every hallway looked the same as it had the night before. Still, predictable, stable, until one of the screens changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that had immediate attention. Just a small, almost imperceptible shift in darkness along the floor. At first, it looked like a lighting fluctuation, the kind caused by distant headlights through a window or electrical inconsistencies in aging fixtures. The guard almost ignored it, but something about it didn't behave like light. It behaved like shape. A faint shadow began to stretch slowly across the polished tiles of Corridor B. It emerged from the far edge of the frame, extending inward with clear direction and definition. It was not flickering. It was not diffusing. It was moving. The guard leaned forward. There was no one there. The hallway itself remained completely empty. The overhead lights were steady. The walls showed no movement, no reflection, no distortion. And yet the shadow continued to grow. It lengthened naturally, as if attached to something just beyond the camera's view. Its edges sharpened as it extended, forming the unmistakable outline of a human silhouette. A head, shoulders, arms. The proportions were correct, anatomically precise. It moved across the floor exactly the way a person's shadow would move while walking. Except no person was visible. The guard stared at the screen, waiting for the source to appear. 3 seconds passed. The shadow advanced farther into the hallway. 4 seconds. 5. Then finally a man stepped into frame. He walked at a normal pace, turning the corner into Corridor B exactly where the shadow had originated. His posture was relaxed, his expression neutral, completely unaware of anything unusual. His body moved forward naturally, and his shadow aligned perfectly with the one that had already been there, not forming it, not creating it, matching it, as if it had been following instructions already given. The guard immediately rewound the footage. Again, the hallway was empty. Again, the shadow appeared first. Again, the man entered afterward. No variation, no overlap, no visible cause. The shadow had not lagged behind him. It had preceded him. It had entered the hallway before he did. And for those few seconds, it had existed alone, moving without a body, arriving without a source, as if somehow it had known he was coming. The first assumption. The first explanation was simple. It had to be, because the alternative was not something anyone was prepared to consider. The guard reported the anomaly at the end of his shift, describing it carefully, without exaggeration. He did not use dramatic language. He did not suggest anything impossible. He only stated what he saw. A shadow had appeared in an empty hallway. Seconds later, a man entered, and the shadow aligned with him. Nothing more, nothing less. The technicians reviewed the report the following morning. They had seen unusual things before: compression errors, frame desynchronization, corrupted data packets. Surveillance systems were not perfect. Small inconsistencies happened all the time, especially in older hardware, so they assumed it was a timing issue, a delay between visual layers, a buffering artifact, something minor, something explainable. They isolated the footage and began examining it using the system's internal playback tools. At normal speed, the sequence looked strange but still dismissible. Shadows could behave unpredictably depending on light angles, reflective surfaces, and camera exposure adjustments. But normal speed was not enough. They slowed it down, frame by frame. At first, nothing appeared unusual. The hallway remained empty, exactly as expected. Every pixel stable, every surface unchanged. Then, without transition, without flicker, without distortion, the shadow appeared, not gradually forming, not fading in, simply present. One frame contained nothing. The next frame contained the shadow, fully defined, fully shaped, with clear anatomical proportions that matched a human figure in motion. There was no intermediate stage, no visual noise, no blending artifact. It did not resemble a rendering error or a compression ghost. It looked real. More importantly, it behaved correctly. As they continued advancing frame by frame, the shadow moved forward with perfect continuity. Its motion was smooth, consistent, predictable. Every shift in its position followed the exact physical rules expected of a shadow cast by a walking person. Except the person wasn't there yet. The hallway remained empty for 72 more frames. 72 frames of independent movement. 72 frames where the shadow existed alone. Then the man entered. His body crossed into view, walking along the exact path the shadow had already taken. His proportions aligned precisely. His pace matched perfectly. Every movement synchronized with the shadow's prior behavior. It was not an approximation. It was an exact match. This created a problem. If it were a delay, the shadow would appear after the man, not before him. If it were a playback error, the shadow's shape would distort, flicker, or break consistency. If it were a reflection, there would be a visible source. But none of those conditions were present. The raw footage was extracted directly from the recording hardware, bypassing the playback software entirely. The original data stream showed the exact same sequence. No signs of corruption, no missing frames, no duplication, no manipulation. Every timestamp was sequential, every frame authenticated. The shadow existed in the recording before its apparent source entered the camera's field of view. Still, the technicians did not abandon their initial assumption. They couldn't, because the alternative required questioning something more fundamental than the equipment. It required questioning sequence itself. Instead, they expanded their search for technical explanations. They inspected the camera's internal clock, perfectly synchronized. They inspected the lighting system. No fluctuations. They inspected the video encoding logs. No irregularities. They even examined environmental factors, external light sources, reflective materials, passing vehicles outside the building. Nothing aligned with the shadow's timing or shape. Every explanation they tested failed quietly, not dramatically, not conclusively, just enough to remove certainty. By the end of the analysis, the official conclusion remained unchanged. Probable synchronization anomaly, temporary visual artifact. No further action required. The label existed to close the investigation, to restore stability, to allow the system and the people responsible for it to continue operating under the assumption that cause still came before effect. But privately, one detail continued to resist dismissal. The shadow had not behaved like an error. Errors are inconsistent. Errors are chaotic. Errors do not move with intention. This had. It had entered the hallway with direction. It had followed a path. It had arrived early, and it had done so with absolute precision. Repetition. The incident should have ended there. Classified, archived, forgotten. Labeled as a minor anomaly and absorbed into the background noise of a system designed to record more information than anyone would ever fully examine. For several days, nothing unusual was reported. The cameras continued to function normally. The hallways remained predictable. People entered and exited the building exactly as they always had. Cause still appeared to precede effect. Movement still appeared to begin when a person decided to move. At least, that was how it seemed. Until someone decided to look again. Not because they expected to find anything, but because uncertainty has a way of lingering long after explanations have been assigned to it. A technician reopened the archived footage and began searching through older recordings, scrolling backward through days that had already passed, moments that had already been lived and completed. Hour by hour, nothing appeared unusual. Empty corridors, occasional movement, familiar patterns, everything behaving correctly. Then, nearly 3 weeks earlier, it happened again. The hallway was empty, completely still, no movement, no activity. And then the shadow appeared. It emerged from the edge of the frame with the same clarity, the same shape, the same unmistakable proportions of a human silhouette walking forward. Its motion was smooth and continuous, advancing across the floor with quiet certainty. 5 seconds later, a woman entered the hallway. She walked along the exact path the shadow had already taken. Her pace matched, her posture matched, her shadow aligned perfectly with the one that had preceded her. There was no deviation, no correction, no hesitation. She had not cast the shadow. She had met it. The technician froze the frame and stared at the screen, comparing the timestamps, verifying the sequence, confirming what the recording showed. The shadow had arrived first. This time the gap was longer, not 3 seconds. 5. He continued searching, now with intention, now with focus, now looking not for normal behavior but for deviation, and deviation appeared, again and again and again. Different days, different individuals, different times of night. Each occurrence followed the same structure. The hallway would remain empty. Then the shadow would enter, alone, moving naturally as if attached to a body that had not yet arrived. Seconds later, the person would appear, stepping into alignment with the shape that had already occupied their position. Sometimes the gap was small, 2 seconds, barely noticeable. Sometimes it was longer, 7 seconds, 9. In one case, 12. Every instance shared the same characteristics. The shadow never flickered, never distorted, never hesitated. It moved with confidence, with precision, with certainty about where it was going. It never searched. It never corrected itself. It never behaved like something uncertain about its destination. It behaved like something that already knew. The technician began documenting each occurrence, creating a timeline, measuring the interval between shadow and arrival. The pattern was undeniable. This was not random. It was consistent, predictable, repeatable. The shadows were not reacting. They were arriving, and the people were following. As the number of confirmed instances grew, something else became impossible to ignore. No one in the footage reacted to their shadow. Not a single person hesitated. Not a single person paused or looked down. They moved normally, completely unaware that moments earlier, their shadow had already occupied the space they were about to enter. To them, nothing unusual had happened. Their experience remained intact. From their perspective, they entered first. From the camera's perspective, they did not. This created two conflicting sequences, one experienced internally, one recorded externally. Both could not be correct, yet both existed simultaneously. The technician reviewed the recordings late into the night, watching shadows walk alone through empty hallways over and over again. Each time the same quiet certainty, each time the same inevitable alignment, each time the same impossible order. Shadow first, person second, effect before cause. By morning, the original explanation, synchronization anomaly, visual artifact system delay no longer felt sufficient. Not because it had been disproven, but because repetition had given the anomaly structure. And structure implied something far more difficult to dismiss. Errors do not repeat with precision. Errors do not follow patterns. Errors do not anticipate movement. But these shadows did. They appeared exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there, as if the event had already happened, as if the outcome had already been decided, as if the shadow was not following the person, but leading them, quietly, consistently, unseen, until someone finally noticed. The interval grows. At first, the difference was small enough to ignore, small enough to rationalize, small enough to dismiss as measurement error, rounding discrepancies, or minor inconsistencies in recording precision. 2 seconds could be explained. 3 seconds could be tolerated. Even 5 seconds could be absorbed into the uncertainty that existed in all complex systems. But the gap did not remain stable. It changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, gradually, quietly. The kind of change that only becomes visible when compared against what existed before. The technician continued documenting every confirmed occurrence, building a timeline that stretched backward through weeks of archived footage and forward through each new day of recording. At first, the intervals appeared random, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 6. But over time, a pattern emerged. The numbers were increasing, not consistently with each individual instance, but consistently over longer periods. The average separation between shadow and person was growing, slowly, relentlessly. The shadows were arriving earlier. At first, this conclusion was resisted. It suggested progression. It suggested direction. It suggested that whatever governed the phenomenon was not static. It was changing. And change implied something active, something ongoing, something that had not yet finished. To verify this, the technician focused on one specific camera in Corridor B, the same location where the first incident had been observed. This camera provided the cleanest angle, the most stable lighting, the least environmental interference. For several days, nothing unusual occurred. Then, at 2:14 a.m. on a Thursday morning, it happened again. The hallway was empty, silent, unmoving. The technician watched the live feed in real time, uncertain whether anything would appear. For several seconds, nothing did. Then the shadow entered. It stretched across the floor from the far corner, extending forward with familiar precision. Its proportions were unmistakable, its motion smooth, controlled, human. It advanced several steps into the hallway. Then it stopped. The technician immediately checked the timestamp. The shadow had appeared, but no one followed. 5 seconds passed, nothing. 10 seconds, still nothing. 20 seconds, the shadow remained, perfectly still, occupying space without explanation. 30 seconds. Then, finally, a man entered the hallway. He walked forward at a normal pace, turning the corner with no hesitation. His posture relaxed, his expression neutral, completely unaware. His shadow aligned with the one already present, matching it exactly. 30 seconds. The technician replayed the footage repeatedly, verifying the measurement. 30 seconds of separation. 30 seconds where the shadow existed independently. 30 seconds where effect preceded cause. This was longer than any previous instance, long enough to eliminate coincidence, long enough to eliminate dismissal. The interval had grown. In the days that followed, the pattern continued. Another instance, 26 seconds, another, 31, another, 39. Each time the same structure. The shadow arrived. It moved forward. It waited. Then the person followed. The shadows did not wander. They did not hesitate. They did not behave like something uncertain about the future. They behaved like something remembering it, as if their movement had already been completed, as if they were not predicting the path, but replaying it. One recording stood apart from the others, captured at 3:03 a.m. The hallway was empty, no scheduled movement, no expected activity. The building itself was nearly dormant at that hour. Then the shadow appeared. It entered slowly, advancing several steps into the center of the hallway. Then it stopped. It did not move again. 10 seconds passed, nothing. 30 seconds, nothing. 1 minute, still nothing. The shadow remained fixed in place, perfectly defined, perfectly still. The technician waited. 2 minutes, 3 minutes. The shadow did not disappear. It did not distort. It did not weaken. It simply remained, waiting. 4 minutes later, a woman entered the hallway. Her pace was steady, unhurried, natural. She walked directly to the exact position where the shadow had been waiting. Her shadow aligned perfectly with it. 4 minutes, 240 seconds of separation. 240 seconds where the shadow existed without its source. This changed everything, because this was no longer a minor discrepancy. It was no longer a technical irregularity. It was no longer small enough to hide inside uncertainty. The interval was expanding, not randomly, not chaotically, but consistently, as if the shadow was slowly separating from the person, as if whatever connection held them together was weakening, or stretching, or shifting. The technician began to consider a possibility that had previously seemed absurd. What if the shadow was not being created in the present? What if it was arriving from somewhere else? Not ahead in space, but ahead in sequence, ahead in order, ahead in time. The shadows did not appear lost. They did not appear confused. They appeared certain. They moved with complete confidence about where they were going and where they would stop, as if the outcome had already been determined, as if the path had already been walked, and the person was only catching up. Each new recording pushed the shadow farther forward. Each new interval widened the separation between action and awareness, between movement and decision, between presence and arrival. It suggested something deeply unsettling, that what people experienced as the present moment was not the beginning. It was the alignment, the moment when the body finally reached a position something else had already taken. And if the interval continued to grow, there might come a point where the shadow arrived long before the person ever knew they were coming, long before the decision was consciously made, long before the experience of choosing existed at all, which meant the shadow was not following the person. It never had been. It was leading. The experiment. By the time the interval exceeded 4 minutes, passive observation was no longer enough. Watching the phenomenon happen was one thing. Allowing it to continue without interference was another. Until that point, every instance had been discovered after it occurred. Recorded, archived, reviewed. The shadows had never been observed under controlled conditions. No one had ever tried to predict them in advance, which meant no one knew whether the shadow could be anticipated, or influenced, or prevented. The only way to know was to remove uncertainty, to create a moment that was fully controlled, fully measured, fully intentional. They designed a simple experiment, nothing complex, nothing dramatic, just a hallway, a camera, and a person. The objective was straightforward. A volunteer would walk into Corridor B at an exact, predetermined time. The entire environment would be stabilized to eliminate as many variables as possible. Lighting would remain constant. No one else would enter the area. Every camera would record continuously, and most importantly, the exact moment of entry would be decided in advance. Not spontaneously, not impulsively, but precisely. The volunteer was a maintenance employee who had worked in the building for several years. He was familiar with the corridor, familiar with the cameras, familiar with the process. He showed no visible anxiety, no hesitation. To him, it was only a test of equipment, nothing more. They synchronized the system clocks using an external atomic time reference. Every camera, every recorder, every monitoring terminal aligned down to the millisecond. The volunteer was instructed to remain in a separate room, out of view of Corridor B. He was given a digital timer. At exactly 02 a.m., he would begin walking. Not before, not after. Exactly at that moment. The cameras were already recording. The hallway remained empty. The technicians watched in silence. Nothing. Still nothing. The corridor remained unchanged, still, silent, stable. One of the technicians leaned closer to the screen. At first, it was difficult to see, just a faint distortion in the darkness along the floor. Then it sharpened, a shadow. It entered slowly from the far edge of the frame. Clear, defined, unmistakable. It moved forward with the familiar proportions of a human silhouette. Head, shoulders, arms, legs, walking. The timestamp read 01:15, 47 seconds before the volunteer was scheduled to move. No one spoke, no one moved. They watched as the shadow advanced deeper into the hallway. It moved naturally, without hesitation, without deviation. Each step consistent with the motion of a person walking at a relaxed pace. But the person was not there. Not yet. The shadow continued forward. It passed the midpoint of the hallway. It slowed. It stopped. And waited. The technicians shifted their attention to the atomic clock display. Time continued moving forward, relentless, uninterrupted. The shadow remained motionless, still waiting. 5 seconds remained. No change. The volunteer began walking. In the separate room, he stepped forward exactly as instructed. His pace was calm, measured, predictable. He turned the corner into Corridor B. The camera captured his arrival, and his shadow aligned perfectly with the one that had already been there. There was no adjustment, no correction, no visible transition. The two were already synchronized, as if they had never been separate at all. The technicians immediately preserved the recording and isolated the data. Every timestamp confirmed the same sequence. The shadow had entered first, 47 seconds early. Not approximately, not nearly, exactly. The precision was undeniable. They reviewed volunteer's activity during those 47 seconds. He had not moved. He had not shifted position. He had not approached the hallway. He had remained in the separate room, visible on another camera, waiting for the timer to reach 0. His body had not cast the shadow. It could not have, because it had not been there. They interviewed him immediately afterward. He described his experience in simple terms. He waited. He watched the timer. He walked when it reached 0. He felt nothing unusual. No sensation of hesitation. No sensation of being pulled or guided. No awareness of anything occurring before he moved. To him, his decision to walk had happened at exactly 0:22. Not earlier, not gradually, at that moment. But the shadow had already completed the action. This introduced a contradiction. If the shadow was tied to the body, it could not move before the body moved. If the shadow was tied to the decision, it could not move before the decision was made. And yet it had, which meant one of those assumptions was wrong. Either the body did not initiate movement, or the decision did not originate where it appeared to. They repeated the experiment 2 nights later. A different volunteer, a different scheduled time. The result was the same. The shadow appeared early. This time, 32 seconds. Again, moving independently. Again, waiting. Again, aligning perfectly when the volunteer arrived. A third test was conducted, 21 seconds. A fourth, 54 seconds. Each time, the shadow arrived first. Each time, the body followed. Each time, the same impossible sequence. Effect preceding cause. Outcome preceding action. Presence preceding arrival. It became clear that the shadow was not reacting to the volunteer's movement. It was not predicting it. It was not estimating probability. It was behaving with certainty, as if the event had already happened, as if the shadow was not observing the present, but reflecting something beyond it, something already fixed, already determined, already in motion. Long before the volunteer experienced the moment of deciding to walk. This transformed the nature of the phenomenon. It was no longer something discovered accidentally. It was something that could be summoned, measured, repeated, verified. And every time it appeared, it delivered the same quiet message. The movement did not begin when the person believed it did. By the time they experienced the decision, something else had already taken the first step. The question. At first, the recordings were treated as technical contradictions, problems to be solved, variables to be isolated, systems to be improved. But the experiment had changed something fundamental. It had removed coincidence. It had removed uncertainty. It had replaced accidental discovery with controlled repetition. And in doing so, it introduced a question that could no longer be ignored. Not a technical question, not a mechanical one, but a human one. After the fourth experiment, they brought the volunteer into the monitoring room. They showed him the footage. He watched himself enter the hallway. He watched his shadow align with his feet. He watched the sequence play out exactly as he remembered it. Then they rewound the video, further back, to the moment before he arrived. The hallway was empty, still silent. Then the shadow entered, alone, moving forward with his exact proportions, his exact posture, his exact pace. He watched carefully. He did not speak. The shadow reached the center of the hallway and stopped. Then they paused the video. The timestamp was visible, 47 seconds before he had begun walking. They turned to him and asked a simple question. During those 47 seconds, did you hesitate? He frowned slightly. Hesitate? Did you consider not walking? He shook his head. No. Did you change your mind at any point? No. Did you feel uncertain? No. He answered each question calmly, without confusion. He had made a decision. He had followed it. Nothing unusual had occurred from his perspective. They continued. When did you decide to walk? He answered immediately. When the timer reached 0. Not before, not gradually, at that exact moment. This was how decision worked. First, the moment arrived. Then the choice was made. Then the body moved. Cause, then effect. That was the sequence everyone understood. That was the structure experience appeared to follow. But the footage suggested something else. Because if the shadow reflected his movement, then his movement had already existed 47 seconds earlier, which meant the action had already been determined. Before he experienced deciding it, they asked him another question. Are you certain you didn't decide earlier? He paused. Not because he doubted himself, but because the question itself didn't seem to make sense. I decided when the timer reached 0. That was the only answer he could give, because that was the only moment he had experienced as a decision. But the shadow had already completed the action. This introduced a gap between experience and reality, a gap between when something happened and when it was perceived to happen. The technicians reviewed the recording again, not focusing on the shadow, not focusing on the body, but focusing on the space between them. 47 seconds, a measurable separation between movement and awareness. It suggested something deeply unsettling, that what the volunteer experienced as the moment of deciding was not the origin of the action. It was the moment he became aware of it. The decision had not been created in that instant. It had been revealed. This contradicted the most basic assumption about human experience, that choices originate inside awareness, that actions begin when we decide to act. But the footage suggested the opposite. The action began first, awareness followed. The shadow moved, the body aligned with it. The volunteer believed he had initiated the movement, but the recording showed that he had entered something already in progress. They considered another possibility. Maybe the shadow did not reflect the body. Maybe it reflected the outcome, not the present state, but the completed state, the final state, the state that already existed somewhere beyond immediate perception. If that were true, it meant the volunteer's movement was never uncertain, never undecided, never open to variation. It had always been fixed, always been determined. He had only experienced the process of catching up to it. This raised another question. If the shadow appeared before he decided, then what exactly was the decision? Was it the cause of the movement? Or was it the moment he became aware of something already determined? They asked him one final question. If you had chosen not to walk, what would have happened? He hesitated. Not because he had hesitated earlier, but because he had never considered the possibility. He had agreed to the experiment. He had followed the instructions. He had done exactly what he intended to do. The idea of not walking had never existed as a real option. Not in his mind, not in his experience, not in his awareness. But the shadow had appeared before he reached that awareness, which meant the outcome may never have been uncertain. It may never have been a choice. It may only have been an event that he experienced from the inside, after it had already begun. The technicians reviewed the timeline again. The shadow appeared, then the body followed. The sequence never reversed. Not once, not in any recording, not in any experiment. The shadow never corrected itself, never hesitated, never arrived late. It was always early, always ahead, always certain, as if it already knew the outcome. And if the shadow already knew, then the volunteer's awareness was not leading the action. It was following it. This introduced a final possibility, that what people experienced as decision was not the beginning. It was the moment awareness intersected with something already in motion, something already unfolding, something already cast. The volunteer left the monitoring room shortly afterward. He returned to his normal routine. He walked through the building, through the same hallways, under the same cameras, experiencing his movements exactly as he always had. From his perspective, nothing had changed. He still felt like the origin of his actions, still felt like the author of his decisions, still felt present at the beginning of each movement. But the cameras had recorded something else. They had recorded the same sequence that had occurred every time. The shadow arriving first, the body following, the decision appearing somewhere in between, not at the beginning, not at the end, but in the middle. In the narrow space where awareness briefly intersects with something it did not start, but inevitably completes. What the shadow knows. For as long as anyone could remember, the relationship between a body and its shadow had been simple. The body moved, the shadow followed, the body stopped, the shadow stopped. The shadow had no independence, no authority, no ability to exist on its own. It was only a consequence, a passive projection shaped by light and obstruction. It could not lead. It could not act first. It could not know anything the body did not already know. That was the assumption. That was the rule. And like all rules, it had remained unquestioned because it had never been violated, until now. The recordings did not show shadows reacting to bodies. They showed shadows anticipating them, arriving first, moving first, stopping first, and waiting, not randomly, not approximately, but with exact precision. Each shadow appeared in the correct position, at the correct time, following the correct path, without deviation, without hesitation, without uncertainty, as if the shadow already possessed complete knowledge of what the body would eventually do. This raised a possibility that was difficult to accept, that the shadow was not simply a reflection of the present, but a reflection of something else, something ahead, something that had already been completed. When people thought about movement, they experienced it as a sequence unfolding forward. First came intention, then decision, then action, then consequence. This was how awareness interpreted time, linear, ordered, stable. But the shadow did not behave as if it existed inside that sequence. It behaved as if it existed outside it, as if it had access to the outcome before the process of reaching that outcome had been experienced. The technicians reviewed hundreds of recordings, searching for a single contradiction, a single instance where the shadow hesitated, a single instance where it arrived early but the person never followed. They found none, not one. Every shadow was correct. Every shadow was accurate. Every shadow was fulfilled. This suggested something deeply unsettling, that the shadow was not predicting the future. It was reflecting it, not estimating probability, not guessing, but reproducing something that already existed in a completed state. This would explain its certainty, why it never corrected itself, why it never needed to search, why it never appeared uncertain, because uncertainty did not exist where it came from. Only outcome, only completion, only final form. This implied that what people experienced as the present moment was not the origin of events. It was the intersection point, the place where awareness encountered something already moving toward completion. The shadow did not need to decide where to go. It had already been there. It did not need to determine what shape to take. Its shape had already been determined. It did not need to wait for the body to create it. It only needed to wait for the body to arrive and align with what already existed. This reversed the entire structure of cause and effect. It suggested that the body was not creating the shadow, the body was confirming it, confirming something that had already taken form beyond immediate awareness. The shadow was not the consequence, it was the evidence. Evidence of an outcome that existed before the experience of choosing it. This raised another question. If the shadow already reflected the final state, then what was awareness? What was the feeling of deciding? What was the sensation of choosing between possibilities? Perhaps it was not the origin of action. Perhaps it was only the experience of arriving at something already determined. The recording supported this interpretation. The shadow never appeared wrong, never appeared uncertain, never appeared incomplete. It was always fully formed, fully resolved, fully decided. It carried information the body had not yet expressed, information the mind had not yet experienced, information that awareness had not yet reached. And yet, inevitably, awareness always caught up, always aligned, always fulfilled the shape the shadow had already taken. This suggested that whatever process created movement did not begin inside awareness. Awareness was not the source. It was the observer, the witness, the final participant in a sequence that had already begun elsewhere. The shadow knew where the body would stand. Before the body stood there, it knew when the body would arrive. Before the body began moving, it knew the outcome. Before the experience of choosing had even occurred. This was not prediction. Prediction can be wrong. Prediction involves uncertainty. Prediction involves probability. The shadow was never wrong, which meant it was not predicting. It was remembering. Remembering something that, from the body's perspective, had not happened yet, but from the shadow's perspective, already had. This introduced a final, inescapable implication. If the shadow already knew the outcome, then the outcome was never undecided, never open, never uncertain. It had always existed in its completed form. The body did not create it. The body only arrived to occupy it, step by step, moment by moment, catching up to something that had already been cast, already been shaped, already been resolved. And the shadow, silent and patient, simply waited for the body to become what it already was. The final recording. The final recording was discovered months after the experiments had ended. By then, active testing had stopped. The technicians had gathered enough evidence to confirm the pattern, but not enough to explain it. There was no protocol for what they had observed, no framework for interpreting it. Only documentation, archived carefully, preserved without conclusion. The cameras, however, had never stopped recording. They continued their silent observation of empty hallways and passing movement, capturing every moment whether anyone was watching or not. The final recording came from Corridor B, the same hallway, the same camera, the same fixed angle that had captured the very first anomaly. The timestamp read 3:07:42 a.m. No scheduled activity, no expected movement. The building was almost entirely empty at that hour. Most personnel had left hours earlier. Only essential systems remained active. The hallway appeared exactly as it always had. Still, silent, unoccupied. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. For nearly 12 minutes, the corridor remained empty. The recording showed nothing but stable fluorescent light and unmoving space. Then, without warning, the shadow appeared. It entered slowly from the far edge of the frame. Its shape was immediately recognizable. Human. Its proportions correct, its movement natural. It advanced across the floor with the same steady pace observed in every previous instance. Its head and shoulders shifted subtly with each step. Its outline remained sharp, stable, fully formed. It was not fading in. It was not forming gradually. It was already complete, already defined, already certain. The shadow moved forward into the center of the hallway. Then it stopped. It did not hesitate before stopping. It stopped because it had reached its destination. This was consistent with every previous recording. The shadow always stopped where the person would eventually stand. So they waited. 10 seconds passed. Nothing happened. 30 seconds. The shadow remained. 1 minute. Still no one entered. The technicians who later reviewed the footage assumed the person was simply delayed, perhaps walking more slowly, perhaps interrupted, perhaps pausing briefly outside the camera's view. This had happened before. Delays were normal. Alignment always followed. 2 minutes passed. The shadow did not move. 3 minutes. Still waiting. 5 minutes. The hallway remained empty, except for the shadow. Perfectly still, perfectly defined. It did not flicker. It did not distort. It did not weaken. It did not behave like something temporary. It behaved like something permanent, like something that belonged there. 7 minutes passed. No one arrived. 10 minutes. Still nothing. The shadow remained in position, occupying space without explanation. This had never happened before. Every previous shadow had eventually aligned with its body. Every previous instance had completed its sequence. Cause had always caught up to effect, but not this time. The technicians continued watching, hoping for movement, expecting resolution. None came. The shadow did not disappear. It did not retreat. It did not change. It simply remained, waiting. The recording continued for over an hour. The shadow never moved. It remained exactly where it had stopped, its edges sharp, its shape intact, its presence undeniable. Eventually, the recording reached the end of its storage cycle and transitioned to a new file. The shadow was still there when the file ended. There was no recorded moment of its disappearance, no recorded moment of its resolution, only its arrival and its waiting. They reviewed access logs for that night. No one had entered Corridor B. No one had approached that position. No one had cast that shadow. They reviewed adjacent cameras. No corresponding movement. No corresponding body. No explanation. For the first time, the sequence had broken. The shadow had appeared, but the person had never followed. This introduced a possibility more disturbing than anything observed before. If the shadow reflected a completed outcome, then this outcome had never been completed, which meant something had interrupted the sequence, something had prevented alignment, or worse, something had prevented the person from ever arriving. The shadow had taken its position, but the body had never come to claim it. This suggested that the shadow did not depend on the body to exist, only on the outcome, only on the final state, and that state had appeared, even though the person had not. The technicians reviewed the footage one final time. The empty hallway, the shadow entering, the shadow stopping, the shadow waiting. It did not appear lost. It did not appear confused. It appeared certain, certain that something was supposed to happen, certain that someone was supposed to arrive, certain that alignment was inevitable, but it never occurred. And so the shadow remained, occupying a position that, according to every previous recording, belonged to someone, someone who, for reasons unknown, never came. The possibility. After the final recording, there were no more experiments, no more attempts to measure the interval, no more volunteers, no more efforts to provoke the phenomenon under controlled conditions. Not because interest had disappeared, but because something fundamental had changed. The final recording had introduced a possibility no one knew how to test, or how to survive. Until that moment, every shadow had eventually aligned with its body. Every sequence had completed itself. The shadow arrived. The person followed, cause restored its position behind effect, order restored its structure, the system remained intact. But the last recording had broken that structure. The shadow had arrived, and no one followed. This meant the shadow was not simply dependent on the body, it was dependent on something else, something deeper, something that existed independently of whether the person ever became aware of it. The shadow had not appeared randomly. It had appeared with certainty. It had entered with direction. It had stopped at a precise location, as if fulfilling a sequence that had already been determined, but the sequence had never resolved, which raised a question no one wanted to ask directly. What if the shadow did not reflect the body? What if the body reflected the shadow? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. What if the shadow was not the consequence, but the template? What if it was the structure the body eventually conformed to? This would explain why the shadow always arrived first, why it never hesitated, why it never searched, because it was not discovering the outcome, it was expressing it, and the body, moving through time with limited awareness, simply caught up, moment by moment, step by step, until alignment occurred. But in the final recording, alignment never came, which meant one of two things. Either the body failed to reach the outcome, or the outcome existed without requiring the body to complete it. Both possibilities were equally disturbing, because both suggested that what people experienced as their present movement was not the origin of action. It was the confirmation of something already established. This transformed the meaning of presence itself. People believed they existed fully in the present moment, believed their actions began when they experienced deciding, believed their movement originated inside awareness. But the recording suggested something else. That presence was not the beginning, it was the intersection, the point where awareness encountered something already in motion, already formed, already cast. The shadow did not emerge from the body emerged into the shadow, into a position that had already been defined, into a path that had already been traced, into an outcome that had already taken shape. This explained why the shadow never needed correction, why it never hesitated, why it never arrived late. Because it was not bound by the same sequence awareness experienced. It did not need to decide. It did not need to choose. It did not need to become. It already was. And the body, constrained by perception, only arrived later, only experienced the outcome after it had already begun. This suggested something subtle but profound. That what people called now was not the origin point. It was the meeting point. The place where awareness briefly intersected with something that had always been ahead, something that had always been waiting. The final recording remained unresolved. The shadow had appeared, but the person had never arrived, which meant the template had existed, but the alignment had not. This left open a final possibility, that somewhere, at some moment beyond observation, the body simply failed to reach the position already waiting for it. Or worse, that the shadow did not need the body at all, that it could exist independently, already complete, already certain, already present, waiting for awareness to arrive, or waiting for nothing, because from its perspective, it already had. Closing. There is nothing left to prove. The recordings exist. The timestamps remain unchanged. The sequence has been observed too many times to dismiss, too precisely to ignore, and too consistently to reduce to coincidence. The shadow appears, then the body follows. Not always immediately, not always closely, but always eventually. Until the final recording. Until the moment the sequence stopped completing itself. Until the moment the shadow arrived, and no one came. This leaves only one question. Not about the cameras, not about the building, not about the shadows, but about you. Because every step you take feels like it begins in the present. You decide, you move, you arrive. That is how it feels. That is how it has always felt. But the recording suggests something else, that what you experience as the beginning may not be the true beginning, that your awareness of deciding may only be the moment you notice something already in motion, something already unfolding, something already cast ahead of you. Right now you are sitting somewhere, reading this, aware of your body, aware of your position, aware of the quiet certainty that you exist here in this moment. It feels immediate. It feels real. It feels like the origin point of everything you do. But if there were a camera watching the space in front of you, watching carefully, watching long enough, there is a possibility that something is already there. Not visible to you, not something you can feel, but something that has already taken your shape, already standing where you will eventually stand, already moving where you will eventually move, already waiting for you to arrive. Because presence may not be something you create, it may be something you enter, something that exists before awareness reaches it, something that remains just beyond the edge of perception. Your shadow has always followed you. That is what you have always believed. That is what experience has always confirmed. But the recording suggests the opposite, that your shadow may not follow you at all. It may lead you, quietly, precisely, taking each step before you know you will take it, reaching each destination before you understand why, and you, moving through the present, simply align with it, simply fulfill it, simply become what was already there. The next time you walk into a room, you will feel like you have just arrived. You will feel like this is where your presence begins. But there is no way to know for certain, no way to see what the cameras might see, no way to confirm whether something entered before you, whether something had already taken your position, whether something had already become you. And if it had, you would never experience the moment it began. You would only experience the moment you caught up, the moment you aligned, the moment you arrived, not at the beginning, but at the place where something else had already been waiting, patient, still, certain for you.
Shadows crawl where the light won't go. A silent wind, it starts to grow.